Reddit, what is the most disturbing thing that has ever happened to you or someone you know? Story 1. This one isn't super exciting, just weird. My grandma was always irrationally afraid of dogs. She liked them, but they made her nervous because they were too messy, loud, and unpredictable. She would always tell us not to leave the door open on nice days. Close that door. A big black dog might walk in. She had this fear that one day she'd turn around and there'd be a big black Labrador drooling on her floors. We always laughed at her oddly specific fear, and we knew everyone who lived nearby and their dogs. The biggest, blackest dog within 1 mile of her house was a Yorkie, so her fear was unfounded. Anyway, years later, my grandma passed away. My dad and I had the sad task of clearing out her house. Things were a bit stuffy, so we left the door open to the yard and got to work. After a while, we both heard a strange noise and looked up. It sounded like panting. We turned around and, I'm not even kidding, there was a big black Labrador sitting in the middle of the kitchen, just gazing up at us happily, drooling on Grandma's linoleum. Just like she always said would happen. We completely lost it. Uncontrollable laughter, crying just a little. We petted the dog and escorted him back outside. My dad shut the door, looked upwards and said, "Sorry, Mom. You were right." Story 2. I developed schizophrenia and had my first schizophrenic episode at work. It started out like any other day, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw things start to shift and distort. I usually saw bugs. That was normal at that point. I had already been diagnosed with psychosis. But this time, it was different. Then out of nowhere, I looked up and clearly saw a hooded person burst in through the doors with a gun. I yelled and dropped to the floor, and everyone around me stared like I was the craziest person on the planet. I was so panicked I didn't care. I could still see the guy, and apparently I was rambling. People started asking what I took or what I was on. I came back to reality and told them I thought I had been drugged. I don't remember much after that. I just kept getting this horrible, sinking, hopeless feeling of dread in the back of my mind. Like an atomic bomb was dropping right next to me, and there was nothing I could do. I still have days like that. That was 6 years ago. Story 3. This happened to my mom when she was 14. She and her stepdad were watching TV one day when all of a sudden they heard the family dog absolutely freaking out, barking nonstop. My mom looked outside and didn't see anyone, so she just dismissed it as the dog being a dog. An hour later, she headed upstairs to go to bed. As she reached the top floor, she noticed the light in her room was on. Growing up with prankster brothers, she assumed one of them was in her room up to something. She opened the door, ready to tell her brother to get out, and was met with a horrifying sight. Everything in her room was upturned, and on her bed was a disheveled woman dressed in my mother's clothes. The woman turned around to see who had entered the room, and upon seeing my mom, she said, "I'm going to kill you," and lunged at her with a pair of clothing scissors. My mom ran as fast as she could. Her stepdad didn't believe her at first, but then he called the police. Long story short, the woman had escaped from the local psychiatric facility and had snuck past my mom and her stepdad, which is what the dog had been barking at. Story 4. In college, I took a local history course. Part of the course required us to dig into the local museum's archives and read the journals, notes, etc. that had been collected over the years and write an essay about a certain subject. Once I had narrowed down my topic, I spent several nights digging through the 100-year-old field journals of this local surveyor. Mostly dull, uninteresting notes about the local geography, survey coordinates, and other mundane details. While delicately going through probably the 15th straight book, I had to wear these special archive gloves, I turned a page and, written in pencil in the middle of the page in the surveyor's handwriting, was my name. First and last name spelled exactly the same, with nothing else written down around it. Just ordinarily written down like when someone quickly jots down the name of a contact. It really creeped me out since the notebooks were probably close to 90 to 100 years old. And as far as I know, nobody had opened them since they had been donated to the museum. Now, the combination of my first and last name isn't exactly rare, but to see it spelled the exact same way in the author's writing was odd, to say the least. Story 5. When I was in elementary school, I used to go ridiculously early for swim practice. One morning I got there and found out it was canceled. That meant I had the whole school to myself. I waited near the school gate, and soon enough my homeroom teacher arrived. I greeted her saying, "Hi, Ms. Grace." Here's where it gets weird. She ignored me and walked past me. Confused, I looked toward the gate, then back at where she had been walking. Except, she wasn't there. I was a bit frightened at this point, so I went to wait outside my locked classroom, which happens to be next to the restrooms. I sat down on the floor. A few minutes later, I heard the eeriest, creepiest laugh coming from the restroom. It was really high-pitched, almost witch-like. It made my hair stand on end. I was so scared I ran back toward the school gate. A few minutes later, my homeroom teacher, the one I had just seen earlier who ignored me and then vanished into thin air, passed through the gate. She saw me and greeted me. I was too freaked out to reply. Until now, I have no idea what on earth happened. It's the only paranormal experience I haven't been able to explain to this day. Story 6. Me and my mate were coming back from a gig in Manchester. It was about midnight and I was driving. We're going down the motorway on a stretch that carries on for well over 100 miles, so we had no need to turn off at any junctions. A few minutes later, we realized we were on a dual carriageway that was getting increasingly smaller, and soon we were on a tiny A road surrounded by 10-foot-high bushes. Obviously not a motorway anymore. Neither of us know how that happened. We both don't remember coming off the motorway, and we don't know how we managed to go from 4 lanes to 2 lanes to 1 lane without realizing. We still do the same motorway run to go to gigs and have never had the issue again, but we always have a good laugh about it on the way home. Story 7. So I was plagued by pretty bad sleep paralysis for the majority of my childhood. Like I would fall asleep normally and wake up with my face in the pillow, unable to move my body as I suffocated. No idea how I even survived those moments, to be honest. Other times I'd hear loud whispering from multiple voices that I couldn't understand just outside my doorway, or hear loud static and doors opening and closing. Standard sleep paralysis, hallucinations, and whatnot. It's rarely an issue anymore because I've altered the way I fall asleep. It only really happens now if I'm in such a state of exhaustion that I can't really fall into proper sleep and kind of end up in limbo between being asleep and awake. Anyway, late last summer, I had just gotten back from visiting family over in England, so I was exhausted from traveling. I ended up falling asleep as I was watching something on my iPad and had some dream that I really can't remember all the details of now. All I remember is that I had fallen asleep in the dream, and the doors in the hallway of this house I was in started to open and shut as if someone was looking for someone, i.e., me. At this point, my dream self had woken up and was pretending to be asleep when the door to the room I was in opened up. I ended up waking up as well, sort of. If you've experienced sleep paralysis, you should know what I mean. I was in that moment when you're conscious that you're not in your dream anymore because you're aware of your surroundings and can feel your body just being an immobile, heavy sack of meat and bones. Once I woke up, I felt this immense pressure, like someone much heavier than me was putting their weight on my back as they leaned over to whisper in my ear. I tried moving, and of course, I couldn't. I started to hear ambient noise, as if there was a wind whipping up in my room, but it had been put through a filter and ended up kind of muted. As that pressure on my back increased, I heard a very deep, sinister voice loudly say, "No one will save you." I actually jolted right up after that, gasping dramatically like people tend to do in movies and on TV. If it wasn't 3 a.m., I probably would have gone and crawled into my mom's bed despite being 20. I just tried not to cry instead and turned on the lights. I ended up forcing myself to stay awake until the sun came up, just in case it happened again. I don't usually scare easily, but that night really shook me. I'm still shaken up by how real it felt. Story 8. My mom's whole side of the family was raised Catholic. They all went to the same church in a small town in the South. I was there one summer as a kid with my mom. I was maybe around 10 years old. My uncle's farmland backs right up to the church. Anyway, things hadn't been going so well on the farm. Crops weren't growing right. Healthy animals were randomly dropping dead. Chickens and small creatures were turning up gutted, even though he had a donkey to protect his cattle. Just strange stuff that had never happened before. One day the adults were acting super weird and cagey. You know how they get when something big is going down, but they don't want to scare the kids? Like that. My grandma, mom, uncle, aunt, some older cousins, and the priest along with another man from the church were all hanging out on my uncle's farm, and they basically kicked me out of the house to go play. Naturally, being a very curious kid, I climbed as high as I could in the nearest tree to the house, trying to eavesdrop. I caught snippets of conversation here and there, but I couldn't figure out what they were up to. Everyone left the house following the priest to the barn, stables, chicken coop, etc. This entire time I watched from the tree. While they were all down at the stables, I heard the door to the house open, and a woman I'd never seen before, maybe 30 years old with brown hair and a blue dress, casually walked out. She briefly looked up at me in the tree. I waved. She ignored me and walked off down the dirt road. Okay then. Once the adults were done with whatever they were doing, we all gathered in the dining room of my uncle's house to have some lemonade my aunt had made, since it was such a warm day. I decided to pipe up and ask who the woman in the blue dress was, since I'd never seen her visit before. Every adult in the room freaked out. My aunt started crying, the priest looked like he might be sick, and I was told the woman was just visiting. Okay, whatever. A decade later, my uncle finally told me that the woman I saw was an apparition that had started appearing to parishioners at the church and then next door on his land. They had assumed she was a lost spirit trying to pass on, but after she attacked the priest at his home, also nearby, and farm animals started showing up dead, they decided she was some sort of demon, one that appeared as a young woman to hide her true nature. The day I saw her from the tree, the adults had gotten permission from the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism on my uncle's land. It appears I witnessed her leaving. I wonder where she was going. I'm 26 years old today, and the story of Evelyn, as the parishioners started calling her, she'd even been seen inside the church, still gives me goosebumps. She was completely expressionless when she looked up at me in that tree. Didn't seem in any hurry to leave either. The moment she was gone, the crops started recovering, and we stopped finding dead and mutilated livestock. I'm not religious, and I'm generally a pretty big skeptic, but I'll never be able to explain what I saw from that oak tree that day. Story 9. There was one time I went camping with two of my buddies, but neither of them were really outdoorsy types. I was just getting them into the whole camping and hunting scene. Now, I love hiking, more like exploring actually, because I hate just walking a trail. You don't see anything new that way. So I took the two friends out a ways, and we got about 2 miles from camp when they decided they wanted to head back. I said fine, showed them where to go on my phone, and made them put a waypoint on the little GPS device I had for them to follow. I wanted to keep going, so I continued alone. They wanted the pistol I had on me for safety, leaving me to walk alone in the forest with only water and nothing else. No big deal, I thought. I found a steep hillside with rocks all the way down when I was about 5 miles from camp, and I decided to go down. I followed the path at the bottom of the slope, which at this point was just a dry riverbed. I kept walking down, and it got steeper the further south I went. When I crossed a certain point, something just felt wrong. I started looking around, scanning the area, but there was a huge log across the two hillsides, and when I crouched down to crawl under it, I felt like I was being watched. I looked up to my left. Nothing. Scanned the riverbed. Still nothing. Then I looked up to the right. Huge black canine. Too small to be a bear, but it looked like a wolf on steroids. That creature and I locked eyes for what felt like hours, but I know it couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. Every second that passed, the feeling of dread just intensified. I slowly moved backward, trying to get out of there, and as soon as I moved, the thing bolted into the forest, away from camp. The walk back was eerie. It didn't feel like I was being watched. It felt more like it would catch me eventually, and that's why I don't ever hike alone anymore. Story 10. I fell out of a tree when I was a young boy, hitting several branches on the way down before slamming hard into the ground. I was alone and wasn't found for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I was heavily concussed, but I clearly remember an elderly man in a dark suit with a dark hat standing over me while I lay there. He just stared at me the entire time and offered no help. Piercing eyes, he scared me. Some teenagers eventually found me, and when I fully came to, there was no man in a hat. I asked them if they'd seen him, and they said there was nobody there. They stood me up and walked me home, while I kept asking about the man and looking for him. Years later, I learned about the Hat Man, and now I'm convinced I was close to death that day, and that he was there to take me to the other side. Kind of like the Grim Reaper, I guess. Story 11. I grew up in a military family, and we moved around a lot. When I was about 3, we moved to a military base in Cherry Point, North Carolina. Every single night for the year and a half we lived there, I would run to my parents' room at night screaming that there was a lady in my closet staring at me. When my parents came in to check, she was gone. Eventually, they started locking their door because it was an every night thing, and they got tired of it. Fast forward 18 years, and I'm sitting with my mom just Googling all the places we used to live for memory's sake. Turns out there's a legend on that base of a ghost of a woman. When they built the base, her grave was separated from her children's. And now it's said she roams the bedrooms of kids on the base looking for her own. I had a panic attack when I read it. The ghost's name is Kissy Sykes, if anyone is interested. Story 12. My parents moved into a house not too long ago, which, in decorative terms, drastically required bringing forward from the 1970s. They brought some builders in and set about it. However, they told me that upon restoring the place, a few odd things happened that, in addition to making them uneasy, nearly drove the workmen from completing their job. The initial happenings came in the form of random knocking and banging that you can sort of explain away. However, one day they heard a crashing sound like a wall had given way in the house. They ran from their bedroom to check it out but could find no explanation. A further occurrence was claimed while my parents were out and the workmen were at their jobs. They said they had heard a large bang from the bathroom, and upon running to see what had gone wrong, they found the radiator had been torn from the wall. Where it lay on the floor, a couple of wooden cabinet units had been piled on top of it. What made this even stranger was that when they investigated, 2 footprints were found in the dust that had settled from the ongoing work. Weirder still was that they were barefoot prints and both of the left foot, even though they were right next to each other. When my parents got home, the workmen were talking to them and threatening to leave without finishing the job. While they were talking, both they and my parents claimed they could hear a faint singing sound without words. They did eventually persuade the workmen to persist, although I assume they must have heard something intense to threaten walking from a big job in the first place. Story 13. I have a half-brother who is a lot younger than me. When he was maybe 2 to 3 years old, I was in a hot tub with him and his parents, and he kept wanting to go underwater. We were trying to explain why he couldn't do that. At some point, my stepmother said something like, "If something bad happened to you, Mommy and Daddy would be very sad and miss you very much." My brother said, "Would I go up to heaven again, Mommy?" Probably explainable, but still creepy. I also have a friend who has an odd quirk in that she has a phobia of things that swing. For example, she won't sit on a rocking chair or a porch swing, can't stand grandfather clocks, and wine chimes make her very uneasy. One day we were out with her mother and the topic came up in conversation. My friend explained that her phobia came from a vivid memory from when she was a small child, in a car seat in the back while her mother drove. She said she was watching something tied to the rearview mirror swinging back and forth, when suddenly they were in a bad car accident, and that's all she remembered. Her mother then said that had never happened. They'd never been in a car accident. Story 14. Years ago, before I met my wife and had my daughter, I had 3 dreams in one night where I had a daughter. In the first one, she was a newborn, next a toddler, and lastly an adult. All 3 felt very lifelike, and I woke up from each with this huge feeling of love and emotion. I felt like I missed her the rest of the day following the dreams. I forgot about it eventually until I had my daughter. It all came back, and it was the same feeling as the first dream I had. She is 5 now, and I still get that feeling. It could probably be just a coincidence, but I feel like I had a vision of my future that night. The biggest reason I feel like that is the case is that my daughter has blonde hair and blue eyes. I remember that sticking out in my dream because nobody in mine or my wife's family has blonde hair. I'm a redhead and she's a brunette. Like I said, could be a coincidence, but it felt real then, and it feels real now. Story 15. I fully believe my old townhouse was haunted. Be prepared for a read. I first noticed things when I was in the living room, and I heard somebody run across my upstairs stomping as they went along. I freaked and checked, and there was nobody. Then, whenever I was in my bedroom and the door was open, I could see strange shadows in the hallway that shouldn't have been there. I started losing it when I was lying in bed with my head next to the wall, and I heard someone knock on the other side. The problem was, my bedroom was on the 2nd story, so there's no possible way that could have happened. Immediately after that, I went to take a shower, and when I took off my shirt, there were long scratches along my chest, which terrified me. My brother and I were terrorized by whatever this was for months, to the point where we both slept in my bedroom because being in a room by ourselves at night was too scary. The last day this entity was noticed, at least by me, was strange. I was upstairs playing video games when I heard a girl crying extremely loud, like it was in the house. I was home alone though, so I had a feeling it was the ghost. I went downstairs and followed the noise, which led me to my kitchen. As soon as I entered the kitchen, the crying stopped. I was confused but thought, whatever, so I turned around and it was right there. It looked strange, maybe 5 feet 6 inches, but it was as dark as the void, like someone took a picture of where I was looking and used a paint tool to draw a completely black figure, then put it in my line of sight. Strangest stuff I've ever experienced. Story 16. The strangest, most inexplicable thing that's ever happened to me happened only a few months ago. I was briefly working a job at a college bookstore where one of my tasks was to call customers who had ordered books that were out of stock and let them know we had received them. I had already called a large number of customers that day and was in the groove of it. I had the process figured out. You either called and got an answer where you had a script to tell them about their book, or you got the answering machine and had a slightly different script. Simple enough. Until I called one number and got neither. Just silence. It threw me off a little, and I hung up after a few seconds. I called back again. This time I heard what sounded like someone picking up and quietly listening. But for some reason, I held my tongue and just listened too. I could hear sounds like people faintly talking in the background. Then I heard a quiet, "Hey, how can I help you today?" A man responded with something along the lines of, "I need to pick up my book." I was confused for a split second until my coworker, standing near me behind our desk, suddenly said, "Hey, how can I help you today?" She was speaking to a customer, a man, who told her, "I need to pick up my book." Suddenly I got goosebumps. I listened for a few moments more. On the line I heard their conversation, but about a second before it actually happened. I hung up, walked out from behind the desk and said to my coworkers, "I'm going on my break." My break consisted largely of me sitting at a table outside and silently wondering what had happened. I didn't make phone calls for the rest of the day, and I never told any of my coworkers. Story 17. When I was about 5 years old, I was playing in my room, which had thick blue carpet wall to wall. I was sitting near my closet on the floor, playing with some stuffed animals, when I heard low growling and barking. I looked around and noticed what looked like dog teeth coming up through the carpet fibers. It was just the teeth and nothing else, and they were opening and closing with the vicious dog noises it was making. It's incredibly difficult to explain exactly how that worked, but it was there. I remember being absolutely terrified and staring at it for a moment before running out of my room and yelling for my mom. When I finally dragged her back into my room, there was nothing there. It never happened again, but it's one of my earliest and most distinct memories. I'm 30 now, so this was a long time ago, and it's very possible my memory could have exaggerated or even added to what I think happened. I even asked my mom if she remembers this happening a few years ago, and she does remember me running out of my room and trying to explain what I saw. I figure my mom remembers my reaction, so it wasn't a dream, which was my first assumption. I still think about it from time to time and still can't figure it out. Story 18. April 12th, 1992, Easter Sunday, rural West Virginia. I was 7. We were at my mama's house. We had just finished the Easter egg hunt and were standing around in her backyard. The sun was low in the sky, maybe 2 hours from setting. My mama's house was up against a hill, and along the hillside were overgrown forsythia bushes. The branches were so long that they bent over and almost touched their roots, creating a long forsythia cave. You could see inside the cave, but you could not get into it. So everyone is hanging around. I think the adults were counting the eggs. A couple cousins were pretending to be Evel Knievel and jumping all of 4 feet off the cellar roof. I was standing a few feet from the forsythia cave, and I kind of went into a trance. As I stared at the bushes, something appeared. I don't know what it was. It was opaque, grayish-white, and swirling inside the cave of forsythia. I wanted someone else to see what I was seeing and explain it to me. I was certain my preteen cousin was standing right behind me. I could feel his body heat, and it almost felt like he was touching my shoulders, but he wasn't quite touching me. So I turned my head to say, "Lee, look at that," and turned back around. The body heat and closeness of another person instantly disappeared as I realized there was no one within 20 feet of me. The swirling blob was completely gone. I felt so strange after that, like I was empty. I did tell my mom about it. She firmly believes the person behind me must have been her father. He died when she was a little girl, barely younger than I was at the time, and she and I look identical, even now. I'm not so sure. I don't believe in the supernatural. Something of note, her family didn't move there until the late 50s, so we don't know who or what was there before, but she and a sibling did find Catholic items buried in the yard when they were younger. Catholicism is pretty rare in rural West Virginia. Story 19. I went hiking in the woods when I was still living in the US. We were renting a small house next to some hiking trails. The trails were well kept and the woods were pretty massive. Anyway, at that time I was working on my PhD thesis and feeling pretty depressed. I had just experienced a terrible panic attack and decided a walk in the woods would help. So I took off and was feeling relaxed. The air smelled like wet grass after a rain shower. The sun was out. I could hear birds and crickets, etc. It was nice. Now there was a big main trail which would branch off into smaller trails. I always took the same smaller trail since I knew it well and was sure not to get lost. So I made my way from the main trail to the small trail. As I kept hiking, the smaller trail branched out again, and you could go either left or right. As I neared the fork in the trail, I saw a figure standing right in the middle of the fork with his back to me. He didn't turn around and he didn't move, except to sway side to side. He was wearing a brown jacket and a brown hat. I kept moving forward a little, thinking he would hear my footsteps on the leaves, gravel, grass, and turn around. But he didn't. I stood there and watched him, his arms straight by his side, swaying back and forth, and decided to book it. Something just felt wrong, you know? I started running and looked back, thinking he might have heard me and turned around. But nope, same position. I went back a few days later, and I was the only one on the trails. I probably could have just said something and asked what he was doing. But I'm a petite 20-something female, and something about the situation made me feel uneasy. Story 20. This happened to my friend, and honestly, I would have freaked out if it were me. And I only found out about this yesterday. She was a kid at the time, I don't remember how old, but she was outside her late grandpa's mansion playing with a red RC car. The backyard of the mansion was about 5 to 7 meters long and led into the woods. While she was playing, she suddenly looked up and saw a figure standing in the woods. She told me the figure had no distinguishable characteristics, as if it were almost a shadow or a silhouette of a man. So she set down her RC car, got up, and tried to open the back door without taking her eyes off the thing. The kicker is, the door wouldn't open. I remember her telling me she tried several times until she finally turned around and started jiggling the handle. Nothing. She turned back around, and the thing was running at her. But not like a person, it was on all fours. She screamed and jumped a fence that was as tall as she was. Adrenaline is one powerful thing. She ended up hiding in her grandpa's garage and felt this comforting feeling, like whatever that thing was couldn't get her in there. Quick note, her grandmother died of a heart attack in that garage. Then she hid under her dad's truck until her parents came back. She also told me they couldn't get her out from under the truck, and that she even bit her dad trying to stay underneath the safety of the vehicle. She ended up sleeping there for the night until they eventually went home. She also noted that when she brought it up with her mom 2 days ago, her mom mentioned that when they went into the backyard, her RC car was smashed, like the Hulk had stepped on it. Story 21. When I was about 5 to 6 years old, I used to sleep beside my grandparents because my brothers and I would stay at their house every summer. So one night, we didn't use blankets, my eldest brother did, because it was particularly warm. I was having a dream. Can't remember what it was. But what woke me up was someone pulling me down from the bed, with ice-cold hands or arms. Please note, I was sleeping in between my grandpa and grandma, and my brothers liked to take the wall side of the bed. At first, I thought my brothers were pulling a joke on me since they were far away from me. But no, it was pitch dark, and I was slowly being pulled further down from where I was. My feet were already hanging off the bed when I started screaming, which woke everyone up. My grandma turned on the lights and asked what was wrong. I told her someone was pulling me down and it was cold. On a warm summer night. She scolded me for screaming and waking them up. My grandpa comforted me. My brothers gave me a blanket they weren't using so I could cover my legs. My grandpa also decided to sleep sideways in case it happened again. It happened more than once. and I always used a blanket since then. Only my eldest brother believed me, because he experienced the same thing too, which is why he always uses a blanket, despite warm summers. Story 22. When I was in high school, my bedroom was downstairs, and no one had ever lived in the house before we did. Often, I would smell this strange scent in my room. It was like a fireplace or a wood stove. The smell itself wasn't strange, I guess, but it was strange because I had no idea where it could have come from. We didn't have a wood stove or a fireplace, nor did any of our neighbors. I also smelled it when no one around was having a bonfire or anything. The smell was also accompanied by an eerie feeling of not being alone. It wasn't a very uncomfortable or threatening feeling, just a sense that someone was in the room with me. It would come and go randomly, and whenever the smell was there, my room would be significantly colder than the rest of the house. The area over my bed was especially cold. You could stand next to my bed, place your hand over it, and feel a large temperature difference. I even eventually moved my bed to a different part of the room, and the cold feeling moved to my bed's new location. Later on, I started to feel an evil presence accompanied with it, as if there were two beings in the room with me, one that wasn't threatening and another that felt menacing. Then I began having sleep paralysis episodes. I would wake up in the middle of the night and not be able to breathe, like someone or something was pressing down on my chest so it couldn't expand. When I'd finally wake up and catch my breath, the wood-burning smell would always be significantly stronger, and after a few minutes, the menacing aura would disappear. It got worse and worse, and eventually I would sleep on the couch some nights. One day it even happened to me on the couch, and I finally had enough. I yelled, "Go away!" After that, I never had the sleep paralysis episodes or the evil feeling in my house again. The wood-burning smell and cold spells would still return, but much less frequently. The neighborhood I lived in was once a plantation. Next to the road into the neighborhood, there was a slave cemetery in the woods that you could see from the road. You could distinguish it from a white cemetery because there were very few last names on the headstones, and many of them had unknown birth dates. Well, a lot of people would throw trash on the side of the road, and it would end up in the cemetery. I occasionally went to clean the trash from the cemetery, and my mother thinks maybe someone followed me home one day. Story 23. This isn't a really disturbing story or anything. More unexplainable. I thought about it though, so I'll share. At one point in my life during high school, I was sort of homeless. It's complicated. Anyways, I used to walk to a gym every morning to shower and work out before walking to school. Sometimes my friends would come work out as well. On days they'd come, I'd get a ride from them so I didn't have to walk to school, which was about 4 miles away, and we'd go to Dunkin' Donuts before class to get some coffee and a donut. Usually I didn't have any money, so I'd just chill and we'd talk for a few minutes. Anyways, being kind of homeless, I didn't really get to eat that much. I didn't get much sleep, and it was a lot of physical exertion walking to school and the gym. I didn't show it, but I was usually exhausted and hungry. Like I said, I was really good at hiding it. Most people at school, besides my close friends, didn't know my situation. So while we were sitting there, this lady walked up to me and handed me a coffee and a donut. I don't clearly remember what she said. It's been over 10 years and I was kind of shocked. But it was something along the lines of, "Something tells me you need this." I wasn't dazed, tired looking, or ragged. I was talking and laughing with my friends. I don't know how she knew, but it was one of the kindest things a stranger has ever done for me. I'll never forget that. Story 24. I have something that's not really horrifying or disturbing, but I can't find an explanation. On the way to work a month or so ago, I was following a banged-up Peugeot 206 with loads of stickers on its boot. There was one sticker in particular that caught my eye. The sticker read, "Too close for comfort," which I thought was odd. On the route to work, there's a large turnoff, which goes toward the motorway and not much else. The Peugeot turned off down that road, and I thought nothing else of it. That was until I rounded the corner further up the road, and the same car was sitting in front of me again. There is literally no way it could have turned around and overtaken me. The road it went down meant it would have to join the motorway. My only explanation is it barreled through some fields and hedges to get back on the road, but I didn't notice anything unusual. Story 25. There was a house way back, before Ghostbusters on the Sci-Fi Channel was even a thing, that my then boyfriend and our friends liked to go ghost hunting at. There are 2 stories about that house that I've written about before. I'm just going to write about the one that's most unexplainable to me for now. Let me get this one key part out of the way. I was never on drugs or drinking when we went ghost hunting at this house, so that's definitely not an explanation. So this house had been abandoned for years, and the supposed backstory is that the man of the house went crazy and killed his wife and kids, and possibly brother too, with an axe. And in the house on the second floor, there were holes in the walls, like someone had used an axe to get into rooms. Now we'd gone there quite a few times. Little weird stuff would happen. Nothing major. Just flashlights and cameras not working. This was before smartphones were everywhere. But one night, we decided to go with a bigger group of people, 10 in all instead of the usual 4 or 5, since one friend, Rich, had a van that could fit a small army that night. So we drive up and decide to break into groups of 2. 2 in the attic, 2 on the second floor, 2 on the ground floor, 2 in the basement, and 2 out in the dilapidated barn. Each pair was to spend about 15 to 20 minutes in their area. My boyfriend and I ended up on the second floor. We walked up the stairs, and this is where things got weird. Almost literally now, I'd been here about 10 times. I checked every nook and cranny. I knew it like my own home. But suddenly there was a room I'd never seen before. A bathroom, with a huge claw-footed tub, and it connected between 2 bedrooms. I swear to everything. That room wasn't there before. I'd walked through those rooms before. I'd looked through all the holes in the walls. This was a massive bathroom, not something you'd mistake for a closet. And I love claw-footed tubs. I'd remember one. I freaked out. Then my boyfriend tried to tell me it had always been there. Nope. He had to be messing with me. But he made me stay in that new bathroom for the full 20 minutes, and I was terrified it was going to blink out of existence and take me with it. It didn't. We were fine. Nothing unusual happened until we all met back up and we got shot at by who knows who while standing near the barn. So we ran for the van and got out of there. But I went back later without the boyfriend, with friends who had also been there before. And guess what? The bathroom was gone. That is, and probably always will be, the most unexplainable thing I've ever personally experienced. It's been 15 years, and if that house is still standing, I doubt it's safe enough to find out if the bathroom ever came back. Story 26. My brother was killed in a work-related accident at a factory. He worked midnights at a place that was running a shady operation and lost his life 10 minutes before the end of his shift while trying to clear an obstruction from a press. He was the backbone of our broken family, my parents' only son, and my best friend. He had a heart of gold and would literally give you the shoes off his feet. I witnessed this once in a mall. We were all so shocked when he didn't come home, and instead 2 officers showed up to deliver the terrible news. We were all sitting downstairs grieving about 2 hours later, just wishing so badly we could have seen him one more time. Then we heard an enormous crash upstairs. My brother was about 6 feet 7 inches, 300 pounds, and loved to skateboard. The sound was exactly like the crash of him coming down hard on one of his boards. Either that or a large piece of furniture falling over. We ran upstairs to check for the source of the noise and found nothing that could have made such a loud crash. Sometime later, I found a Coke bottle with his name on it. I bought it and brought it home. When I originally grabbed it from the cooler, it looked like a normal, dark Coke. But only an hour later, when I gave it to my mother, it had turned into a much paler brown. We were so puzzled that I took the tiniest sip, and it didn't taste like anything. No carbonation or flavor. It now sits next to his urn to this day. There have been many other instances where we've felt his energy. But one moment especially stands out. My boyfriend, who never got the chance to meet my brother, was parking next to my car at his apartment. I was in his passenger seat, looking at my phone. He suddenly jumped and said, "Whoa, I swear there was just some big guy in your back seat." I looked over. Of course, my car was empty. I just smiled and said, "That's my guardian angel." Story 27. When I was young, perhaps around 8 or 9 years old, I was very loudly told off by my mother for something or other that I'd done, and I'd been sent to my room. I arrived in my room in tears of anger and frustration, and the emotions grew to a point where I had to yell. Something, anything. The anger was overwhelming, certainly beyond anything the situation called for, I'm sure, but I had to let it out. I yelled, "I want my mummy!" Everything went still inside me. The anger washed away. The tears stopped. I was left with an odd question. Why would I be crying for my mother when my mother had just told me off and sent me to my room? It made no sense, even to my young mind. and I recall it clearly as being the first time I ever used reason to examine my own feelings. The event is crystal clear in my memory even now. When I turned 17, I discovered, almost by accident, that my mother was not my mother. Instead, she was my father's ex-girlfriend, and he had kidnapped me from my family home when I was 3 years old before abandoning me with her to run off with yet another woman. My pseudo-mother had never told me the truth, but had instead convinced me that everything was perfectly normal. I'd always known somehow that it was not. It might not seem inexplicable or disturbing to you now, but at the time, to my child mind, it was both, and that feeling has stuck with me over the next half-century. I've been self-analytical ever since, to the point of a fault perhaps. There are other things in my life that I struggle to explain even now, strange occurrences of various kinds, but this was the first time I realized that something was wrong, and then examined it. Story 28. One time I was out tent camping as a kid, and we kept hearing weird sounds coming from out in the woods. My dad went to investigate, and he said he found a bunch of empty bottles in a torn-up sleeping bag out there. I went out to see for myself a little bit later while everyone was busy, and I heard these weird grunting noises. Although I was scared, I followed them to what I assumed was the filthy campsite my dad had found earlier. Nothing. Just as he said, torn up dirty sleeping bag and a bunch of bottles. But I kept having this sensation that we were being watched or stalked for the next couple of days. I even started having nightmares about bears and monsters and stuff. On our last night camping, I had this horrible dream about a bear coming into my tent and biting my feet. It was so vivid and realistic, I was paralyzed with fear. I woke up and realized the sensation was real. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the face of a filthy elderly man sucking on my toes. He ran off into the night, and I never really told anyone about it until now. Story 29. Okay, I'll bite. I may have posted this once before, but I'm remembering it all again. This was about 6 to 7 years ago. I was dating some wild firecracker redneck girl. One of her favorite things to do was go out late at night and drive to old cemeteries and graveyards. On clear nights with the moon out and shining, they really are an interesting sight. One night we were at one called Pointer Cemetery up about as far north in Kentucky as you can get. It was something like 1 or 2 a.m., and it was one of those spectacularly clear nights. The cemetery was built in such a way that the road going in curved and met back with itself, forming a circle. We drove in and turned around. We were on a slight incline, and when we reclined in our seats, we could see up out of the windshield, had a nice view of the sky. We were talking, but then hit a lull and were just enjoying the scene, when all of a sudden, a bright orange light flared to life about 40 to 50 feet away from the car in front of us, slightly to the left. It looked like a large floating orb, hovering about 10 feet in the air. It hung there glowing. Slowly, the light started getting bigger and began illuminating more of the cemetery in an expanding circle of pale orange light. I suddenly got the feeling of being very unwelcome. Then the light began to recede back in on itself and disappeared. It all happened in maybe 5 to 6 seconds. Tops. I turned the car on and floored it out of there. The girl claimed it was white. I saw orange. She had a friend who was really into paranormal stuff, and that friend claimed it was an orb, some kind of spiritual entity. Supposedly, white is a neutral or welcoming presence, and orange is an unwelcome one. The girl claimed she didn't feel unwelcome. I sure did. Story 30. When I was almost 2, my mom and I lived with my great-grandma Vera. There was a usual pattern. I would wake up and wake my grandma up. She would take me to the living room, make me some cereal, and put on Beekman's World. Then she'd go back to sleep, and when the clock said 8 o'clock, I was to wake her up again. This morning was just like the others, except when the clock said 8 o'clock and I went to wake her up, she wouldn't wake up. I had never seen a scary movie or had any idea what death was, according to my mom, but I knew she was dead. I started crying and walking down the hall. My mom was using the restroom and asked why I was crying. "Gumma's dead." She rolled her eyes but went to go check on her while I sat in the living room. Then I heard my mom screaming, "Grandma, Grandma," and sobbing. I've talked to my mom a few times about this since, and she really doesn't like talking about it. She says it unnerves her because the coroner said she passed away at around midnight, but I swore Gumma made me breakfast and put on TV. The TV was on the right channel, and I had cereal that I couldn't reach by myself. Story 31. I was walking home one evening down the road I still live on when I got that horrendous creeping tremble between my shoulders and up my neck. The kind I'd only ever had before when I was being followed by some creepy man in a city. A whole different story. So I was looking around, trying to figure out why I felt like this on a quiet country road in broad daylight. Finally, I noticed a figure across the field next to the road, too far away to see any details. I figured it was just the farmer checking his crop and kept walking. Honestly, kudos to my instincts for picking up someone that far away. It was across a sure 20-acre field. I carried on walking. The feeling didn't go away. I turned back to check if the figure was still watching me. The idea of someone just staring at me from far away was starting to make me mad. That's when things got weird. The figure was now about 3 times closer than before, still just standing there watching. That was way too fast to have moved that distance, especially through waist-deep barley. But I tried to brush it off. I picked up my pace. I was only half a mile from home. I also cursed myself for leaving my phone at home. The feeling got worse. I walked about 200 yards without looking again, just determined to get home. But finally I had to stop and turn around. This figure, whatever it was now on the road about 50 yards back. Close enough to see details, except there were no details. It was just shadow. I could see the outline of arms, legs, and a head, but no features, no shirt color, no face, nothing. In broad daylight. I stared at it for a moment before stepping back. It didn't move. I shouted something like, "Hey, can I help you?" Still nothing. So I turned around and booked it home. I was wearing riding boots, which are a nightmare to run in, so I was slipping all over. When I got to my door, I looked back, and it was standing at the top of the driveway, still watching. I got inside, slammed and locked the door, and looked out the window. It was gone. Do I know what it was? Nope. Do I want to know? Also, probably not. Story 32. Used to live in a colonial house in Wharton, New Jersey. Very old house, which had been renovated over the years. Except the basement. That part was basically just a giant dirt tomb. No floors, no walls, just dirt everywhere. I was in 3rd grade, and everyone in my family worked in the mornings. Except my mom, who was a stay-at-home seamstress. A couple of mornings while waiting for the school bus with her, we'd hear this bounce sound coming from the basement. Along with it, we'd hear a faint giggle or laugh, but from an older woman. It would last a couple of minutes, a few laughs, and that distinct sound kickballs make when you bounce them. It freaked me out, but my mom, used to paranormal activity from the old country, just brushed it off. She once told me something I always think of when I feel creeped out. If there's a ghost or being, they're lonely or searching for something or someone, let them be in peace. Acknowledge them, and if it's a good one, it will either go away or show you something before it moves on. I later found out that an older tenant had died in that house from natural causes. She used to be a nanny who loved to play with kids. Story 33. 2 nights ago, my husband and I were going through an old box of books we hadn't opened since moving over a year ago. Several of them are old books from his late grandfather, mostly religious, philosophical, spiritual, and historical. He kept notes in the margins. His thoughts, questions, ideas. It's awesome to get such an intimate peek into the mind of someone I've never met, especially since I see so many similarities in the kinds of questions I've been exploring myself over the last few years. My husband pulled a piece of paper out from inside one of the covers. It was a bio of a man who held a Bible study his grandfather had apparently attended. My husband immediately recognized the bio. It was one of his own former college professors. He had no idea his grandfather had known this man. Delighted by the coincidence, he looked at the cover again. Turns out the man had actually authored the book as well. He also not only taught at my husband's alma mater on the West Coast, but also the college I attended in the Midwest, as well as a small private college in my Midwestern hometown. It was beyond crazy, especially combined with a wild familial coincidence we discovered years after we met. It's these kinds of coincidences that make me wonder if we're part of some planned covert bloodline project or something. I joked, like we were betrothed before birth. We laughed. Then my husband flipped to the middle of the book. His head dropped for a beat, and then he looked up at me with a look of quiet, amused defeat. He nudged me to look. At the bottom of the page in his late grandfather's handwriting was written, "There are no coincidences." Story 34. My elderly mother and mentally disabled baby brother died in a fire last year. I blame her for it. I stopped about a dozen fires in our home before I was even 13 years old. She had an oxygen regulator and smoked, and took sleeping pills for her insomnia. You can see where this is going. I was driving from Massachusetts to Florida when I got a call in New Jersey that my mother and brother hadn't made it out of a fire that morning. I completely blame her, 100%. Flash forward a year later. We made it to Florida, and I began to suffer severe bereavement. I started having to constantly distinguish between hallucinations and reality. Not to sound arrogant, but I'm a fairly intelligent man, and I clung to that as a lifeline to stave off the anxiety attacks and fight back the entities I was seeing. My youngest takes a while to fall asleep. I pace in my bedroom with him over my shoulder, patting his back. I work from home and often late, so everyone else was already asleep when I heard him stir. I told my wife, "Don't worry, I'll grab him." I'm pacing. It's midnight. One window in the room faces the street. I saw a glow piercing through the darkness, so I cautiously walked toward it. She was standing there, in the middle of the street, right past a small hump in our front yard, where a large creepy tree stands. She stared at me with the most hateful eyes I've ever seen. My little brother lay on the ground beside her, completely engulfed in flames, rolling and screaming, "Brother, help me!" I handed the baby to my wife and ran outside. In my experience, walking through these hallucinations makes them vanish. But when I opened the front door, she was still there. He was still screaming. I ran into the street. They didn't disappear. I dropped to my knees and screamed, loud enough to wake up 3 of my neighbors. "Leave me the hell alone! Go away!" My neighbor from behind us ran over and found me in the street, crying uncontrollably. In that moment, I felt like I was losing the war in my head. These hallucinations had started walking through me at night. In the hallway when I left my office to sleep. They weren't afraid of me anymore, and that terrified me. I spent every bit of energy I had fighting them, and then one day, they stopped. It's been 6 months. Nothing since. Story 35. This will likely get buried, but here goes. My dad had a stroke 6 years ago and passed away in the hospital officially 2 days later. He was a Buddhist, which is important in the events that follow. They showed scans that the brain damage was so severe he had no way of recovering and would die immediately if ever taken off life support. So we decided it would be best to let him go. My sister, mom, girlfriend, and I gathered around his bedside to say goodbye one last time. As we cried and said our last words, he physically shed a tear. He had been completely unresponsive before that. This is where it gets really crazy. Right after we left his hospital room, my girlfriend's behavior changed drastically. She stood up straight, had a blank stare on her face, and didn't speak at all. I kept asking her if she was okay, but she just stared past me. Then she turned to me and said, "Follow me," and started walking down the hall. We were on the far end of a very large hospital. We walked for about 15 minutes, navigating through stairwells and multiple unmarked turns to reach the maternity ward, which, mind you, neither of us had ever been to in that hospital. She had that same blank stare the whole time. She walked up to the glass where you can see the newborns and placed her hand directly on the glass. Then she looked at me and said, "I'm here now. It's okay." I almost fainted. I started crying profusely while she had no reaction at all. I stayed there for about 30 minutes, just looking at the newborn babies, then walked back to where our family was near my dad. My mom and sister could tell she was acting extremely strange and let her lie down for a nap. She woke up 2 hours later, and to this day, she's my wife now, has no recollection of the event whatsoever. Side note, when my dad was 48, he started telling me he might not make it to 50 and that everything would be okay. He always had a calm demeanor and was very open about reincarnation and death. He died at 49. Still shakes me when I think about it to this day. Story 36. When I was around 5 years old, I woke up one night and saw 2 glowing figures walking in the hallway, passing by my room every now and then. They were glowing, but in a strange way. They weren't casting light onto their surroundings. Everything around them remained as dark as usual, as if the figures couldn't affect the things around them. They were just vivid silhouettes without any visible detail. I could vaguely make out that they were humanoid. One appeared to be male and the other female. They were walking in slow motion across the hallway, up and down in a trance-like drift, like they were gliding along the floor. They kept going and going and going. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried not to look at them. I was terrified. I didn't know what they were, and they seemed so real. And that was more than enough to nearly make me wet myself. Somehow, I fell asleep after hiding under the blanket for a while. The next day, I told my parents about what I saw, and they dismissed it, saying I must have been dreaming. Story 37. This happened about 8 years ago when my grandma died. In the days leading up to her death, she told my aunt that she kept seeing our grandpa in her dreams. He had died when my dad was still a kid. She said he told her it was time to pass on, that my dad and his siblings were doing well now, so she could rest. Days later, she passed away while being taken to the hospital. My parents and I were living abroad at the time, we're Sri Lankan, and we came back to Sri Lanka the very next day. On the day of the funeral, the most peculiar thing happened. A huge butterfly, I think it was an atlas moth, flew in and landed on my grandma's coffin and just stayed there. We had tons of guests that day, many trying to take a photo of the moth, but despite all the commotion, it didn't leave. It stayed for hours. Just an hour before we were about to take her body to the crematorium, another atlas moth flew in and landed beside the first one. After about a minute, the two moths flew up, circled the room together, and then flew out of the window and disappeared. My dad believes the first moth was my grandma, and the second one was my grandpa. Reborn. It was like he came back to take her with him. My aunt told me that my grandfather used to call my grandma Butterfly. Story 38. Back in 2011, I was addicted to painkillers. I retreated to Reno, Nevada to stay with my father and get clean. During that time, I got a job as a security guard for the annual Reno Stead Air Races, just basic peacekeeping duties. The first day I showed up to get my radio, jacket, and passes, my dad and I walked around the setup area of the air show, took pictures of the planes, and had a great day. Fast forward 24 hours. First day of races. Everything was going great. I was getting excited since my shift was about to end, and I could finally grab a beer and some food. Then I heard a sound I can only describe as a shirt being ripped by a fan. 3 seconds later, I saw a P-51 Mustang moving at over 500 miles per hour. Dive bombing, literally straight at my head. In that brief moment, I thought that was it. I pushed the couple in front of me to the ground and landed on top of them. The plane lifted at the last second, only to crash into the crowd ahead of me. 1 second, people were there. The next, they were just gone. By the time the couple and I got to our feet, half of those people were gone. The couple from New York thanked me as I ushered them to safety. People were crying, screaming, missing. That day replays in my head a lot. After doing my job and helping others, I wandered around in the aftermath. The smell of fuel, the smell of bodies. It took maybe 15 minutes for me to realize what I was seeing and smelling. Chunks of happy air show goers, their hair and belongings, just too much sensory overload. I found an old man wandering around, confused. We soon learned his son and wheelchair-stricken grandson had both died in the crash. His sobbing, the hug he gave me. I'll feel it for 1,000 lifetimes. I've never been more devastated in my life. It's going on 7 years now, and there still isn't a day where I hear a prop plane and don't nervously look up. This is just one story from that day. There are far more gruesome details, but trust me, it's not something you'd want in your head now, or 7 years from now. I promise you that. Story 39. About 3 years ago, my grandmother was in the hospital. She wasn't going to make it. She had lived with us for 15 years, so we were very close to her. We drove 4 hours to be with her before she passed. She lived in a small town. They couldn't give her the care she needed there, so they life-flighted her to the city, which meant we had to drive back up. My mom went in the plane with my grandmother, leaving my sister to take care of us. On our way back, we turned around and were parked facing the opposite direction. I can't remember why we were on that side of the road. Anyway, my sister was driving and checking her mirrors, getting ready to hang a U-turn. I checked the mirrors too and saw a little red car coming. My sister said, "I'm going to hit this car." I thought she was making some sort of joke and played it off. Right as the car was passing us, she swerved directly toward it. I swear that car bent around our truck. The person driving must have had lightning-fast reflexes. They didn't stop afterward or even honk. They just drove off. My sister was shaking and said, "I didn't see it." That confused me. I reminded her of what she had just said, but she denied ever saying it. My brother, who was in the back seat, said he heard her say it too. Her face went white and she burst into tears. I have no clue what happened that day. and neither does she. Gives me cold chills just thinking about it.